This video was made possible with the kind support of CATAPULT, a Caribbean arts grant, the American Friends of Jamaica, Kingston Creative, and Fresh Milk Barbados.
Good day, everyone. My name is Brian Ashing, and I'm a visual artist from Trinidad and Tobago. In this video, I'm going to be walking you through the step-by-step process of how I created this watercolor painting of the Blacks Marl Quarry in Jamaica. On a recent trip to the island, I noticed the site being this huge outcropping in the mountain face, um, the stark white against the lush greens. And so it really inspired me to create a piece that speaks to some of the environmental issues that we're currently facing and also act as a sort of catalyst for a conversation about how we recognize these environmental issues in our everyday lives.
Now, before I actually get into the painting process, I just wanted to go over some of the tools that I'll be using. So in terms of the brushes, I'm using a number 2 long round from Princeton, the number 8 flat shader from Princeton, the number 10 round from Winsor Newton's Cotman series, as well as a 3/4 inch brush from Winsor Newton Cotman series as well. There may be a few other brushes, but these are the main ones. In terms of the surface, I'm using watercolor paper from the brand Arch or Arches. For this painting, I'm using a 100% cotton 140 pound 10 inch by 14 inch sheet of paper. And here you can see some of that detail of the surface itself. This being the cold pressed paper has a slightly rough texture. Lastly, the paints I'll be using mainly come from the Van Gogh or Van Gogh brand, as well as the Winsor and Newton Cotman series. So firstly, when I look at the reference photo that I took, I decide on how I want to slightly change the composition. What aspects of the picture do I want to focus on for this painting? For me, I wanted to focus on the mountainside and the exposed rock. Once I was satisfied with what I wanted to represent, I then made a simple pencil drawing on the paper which would act as a guideline for the rest of the painting. And since it's a guideline, it doesn't necessarily need to be in much detail. Really and truly, I'm just sort of drawing out the general shape or silhouette of the mountainside or just a bit of the trees in the midground and foreground. I choose not to draw the clouds as I tend to change this aspect of the painting in my landscapes. So, whereas I do try to stay true to what I'm seeing in the photo and what I remember from the site, I also like to add or take away things that I think will make the piece stronger. Once I'm satisfied with the pencil work and the guidelines, I then move on to stretching the paper. Now, this is a really important step in a watercolor painting as it really loosens up the fibers of the paper. It essentially gets the paper ready for better absorbing the paint, better spreading the paint, and making the application of the painting process easier. My method of stretching the paper is to simply submerge it in clean water for a couple seconds, remove it, let the excess water drain out, lay it down on my work surface, tape the edges, and allow it to dry for a couple of hours. When it's completely dry and there are no bends and folds, I know that I can start painting. This process will also reduce the amount of bending and folding that will happen on the paper as you wet the surface throughout the painting process. When I'm painting a landscape, the first aspect I like to start with is the sky. And this is because the sky is the part of the painting that is behind everything else. all other aspects, such as the hills, the trees, will be in front of the sky and are generally darker. So I paint these guys using a wet on wet process, meaning the paper is wet and my brush is pretty wet. This wet on wet application of paint is really useful for painting skies where you don't really want a lot of hard edges. You want the clouds to have this soft, ethereal look to them. The wet on wet painting application also helps with creating smooth gradients. For the sky, I'm using two colors, cobalt blue and turquoise. I'm using a bit of turquoise just towards the horizon to give a bit of variation in the sky. However, because I haven't drawn the clouds in it, and because I'm not using any kind of masking or tape to block those areas, this presents a bit of a challenge with creating a smooth gradient, because I essentially have to paint around the cloud areas that I'm going to be sort of imagining as I lay down the paint. And trying to keep that soft look to the clouds, what you'll see me doing throughout the painting process is revisiting that area where the blue of the sky meets the white of the clouds. I revisit this area with a clean, slightly damp brush, just softening those hard edges that form where the paint meets a dry area. Once I have the base layer done, I then start to intensify that blue with a bit more cobalt, especially towards the top of the painting. I do this by laying down small areas of concentrated blue and just feathering the edges out into the layer that's already dried below. So in this process of intensifying the blue, two things are going on. I am making the sky more saturated, one, but also deepening the tone of the sky. And this helps to highlight the brightness of the clouds and can also help me to shape the clouds. I'm also shaping the clouds by using a slightly subtractive technique where I wet the paper and remove some of the paint that's already there using a clean tissue. Now that I'm satisfied with the sky that I've painted so far, I'm going to move on to the base layers of the rest of the painting, starting with the rock face. Now, although this part of the mountain looks white, on closer inspection we can actually notice that this bright surface has a lot of different hues and tones in it, and is actually really reflective of its surroundings. So I'm using different colors such as Payne's Grey, Burnt Sienna, and later on even some hints of ultramarine. I'm using very watered down mixtures at this point, um, bearing in mind that I'm going to be building up a couple layers to achieve the look. It's also important to remember that as the painting progresses, you're going to be able to use other points of reference to inform whether or not you need to darken certain areas or if certain areas need to be lighter than other areas. In this case, once I start painting the vegetation around the outcropping, I'm gonna know exactly how light it actually is in comparison to the surroundings. So at this stage, it's okay if the mountain face looks lighter than I think it will end up being, because I know that I can always go in later on and darken if I need to. For the gravel and rocks in the foreground, I'm using the same combination of Payne's Grey and Burnt Sienna. However, I want to make it more saturated, so I'm using a bit more paint this time. I'm also adding a bit of red towards the right side of the piece, and to create the shadows, I'm adding a bit of that ultramarine. Now that I've done the base layer for the rocks and the mountain face, I'm going to be moving on to laying down the base layers for the vegetation and the trees, starting with those on the hillside. I'm using a mixture of Payne's Grey and Viridian and applying it in light washes using that flat shader brush. And this brush is actually really useful for this part of the painting, since on one side it gives me this sort of centimeter thick line, and turning it on the other side it gives me a really thin line that I can use to sort of draw those angular shapes that we see at the tops of the hills. As I move down into the midground and foreground, I'm paying attention to the different types of species of trees that I see in the photo reference. In doing so, I'm adding a bit more viridian to the mixture to increase the saturation, and also introduce sap green and permanent green, which tend towards yellow and are warmer. And as I continue to lay down this base layer, I'm not trying to achieve any level of detail at this point. The main point of this layer is to establish those tones and color values that will later inform the other layers that I'll paint later on. In painting the second layer of the exposed rock, I'm trying to manually build the texture of the roughness of the rock face by choosing to not paint over certain areas of the base layer, and these areas will pretty much act as parts of the rock that catch the light. As I begin to paint the vegetation on the hillsides with a darker tone of green, I'm now going to really be able to tell how light the exposed rock face that I just painted actually is. It's also going to create a nice clear separation between the sky and the landscape. The contrast that painting the vegetation creates begins to inform whether or not I need to revisit certain areas. It's important to remember that when painting with watercolors, unlike, let's say, oils, the tones and saturation of the color can change a lot when it dries. So it's common to have to go over certain areas with more layers several times in order to achieve the look that you have in mind. For instance, I found that the exposed rock that I just painted didn't have enough coolness in the shadows, so I decided to go over it with a light wash of ultramarine mixed with Payne's Grey. At this stage, I noticed that the rock face was a bit too light and a bit too neutral um, as compared to the photo reference. So I just decided to go over it with a light wash of ultramarine and Payne's Gray, just to give it a bit of that cool uh, tone, that cool temperature in terms of color values. Often when I'm painting a forest in the distance, I like to use a wet on wet approach. This helps me to keep things a bit abstract and achieve a more general look or feel of a forest rather than painting each individual tree in detail, especially for this piece where the forest is not the main focus that I want to bring to the viewer's attention. I still, however, like to follow the rules of light and how it reaches the canopies more than the understory. So you'll see me painting certain areas with more Payne's Gray to show the shadows, and also leaving certain areas with the base layer coming through to show where perhaps branches are catching more of the light. So as I continue to paint the trees in the midground, what you will notice, um, similar to how I painted the rock face, I'm leaving certain areas undisturbed, certain areas that I had painted in the base layer, which will essentially act as, parts of the trees that are sort of poking through and picking up that sunlight. As we get into the foreground, painting the vegetation, I'm adding more saturation and more detail as compared to the trees in the background. To do this, I'm using a sort of stippling technique to build the three-dimensionality of the plant's structure. Similar to the trees in the background, I'm using more of the Payne's Gray Viridian mixture towards the base of the vegetation, while leaving a lot of it um, with the exposed base layer. In painting the gravel and rocks and sand in the foreground, I'm increasing the saturation of the warm colors like burnt sienna, but I'm also balancing this in the shadows using paint gray and ultramarine. This gives a nice contrast between warm and cool tones and also helps to pull the viewer's attention to this part of the painting. As you can see, the flat shader brush is really useful in this part of the painting as it helps me to sort of carve those rock shapes, the angular edges that we see in those boulders. Continuing with detailing the vegetation, I'm now going over this patch of grass where I already laid down a very yellowish green base layer and going over it now with the stippling technique to simulate the texture of the grass. Once that layer of detailing is completely dry, I go over it once more with another wash of that yellowish green color, this time in more concentration, just to add a bit more of that green vibrance and bring some attention to that part of the painting. At this point of the painting, with everywhere having at least a base layer or some level of detailing, I'm able to step back and look at what areas need some more attention. So one of the first areas that I wanted to address was the foreground, that bit of gravel and vegetation. I wanted to make the vegetation pop a bit more and also darken that bit of gravel. In general, I wanted to also darken more of the gravel in the midground since I wanted the exposed rock in the background to stand out a bit more. I really wanted to deepen the shadows in this part of the gravel in the foreground in order to create these sort of lines that guide the viewer's eyes up towards the mountains in the distance. And just to give it more of that rough texture without disturbing the layers of paint below, I'm actually applying it with a slightly damp sponge and just tapping it into the paper. So I decided it was actually necessary for me to revisit the sky a bit more. I found that it could have used some more contrast, some more dark blues. So I'm going over it mainly towards the top of the piece with a mixture of cobalt blue and ultramarine deep, just to darken it a bit more and introduce more contrast in the sky. So once again, I'm using that 3/4 inch brush from Winsor & Newton, but I'm also going to use that subtractive technique by wetting the area and just lifting the paint using a clean tissue. I found that this creates a more organic and light look to the clouds. Continuing with this sort of reviewing and improving stage, I found that I needed to revisit a lot of the vegetation in the painting. I found that most of it was missing a lot of shadows, which would separate the different planes and give the illusion of different distances. Continuing with this sort of reviewing and improving stage, I wanted to revisit more of that vegetation and gravel in the foreground and midground. I found that the vegetation was mostly missing that extra bit of shadow that gives it the three-dimensional look. Now, the last thing I wanted to do with this painting was add a bit of those pink flowers that I see in the photo reference. Normally, I would have liked to block these areas off using masking fluid, but I did not have any at the time of creating this painting. So, in order to overcome the challenge of painting a lighter color over a darker area, I've added a bit of white to the permanent rose color and sort of created this opaque, almost gouache paint. So here we have the completed painting of the Blacks Marl Quarry in Jamaica. I'd like to thank you so much for watching, and I'd also like to thank once again the CATAPULT Caribbean Arts Grant, the American Friends of Jamaica, Kingston Creative, and Fresh Milk Barbados for making this video possible.